Matua Karl Wixon tēnā koe, kai a koe te wā.
Kia ora no tātou e mihi nui nui, e mihi ki te whānui o ako pānuku, me nā kai whakahaere o tātou kura o te motu, nā kai akako, tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou. He uri au o tahu pōtiki, ki te tahatoko hākoro ko Waitaha ka te māmoe kaitahu me Moriori oku iwi, ki te tahatuki hākui ko Ngāti tō rangatira ki Wairau oku iwi. He taunga o tōku kaike nāia nei, tōku mahi, he kaupapa holaka hau. So yes, the designing futures and making shift happen is what myself and my mahi is all about. So I'm really honoured to be here talking to you all today, and I'm now going to endeavour to share screen and get this show on the road. So I had the pleasure and the privilege to do a presentation last year to Ako Pānuku and invited back to share a similar kōrero and hopefully extend on it a bit further. Just, I guess, for context, that kaupapa of designing futures and making shift happen. I come from a creative sector background. I kind of work at the strategic end of creative. I originally trained as a product designer, industrial designer, and I've just about worked in every design sector you can throw a name at. But progressively driven by kaupapa Māori, worked more towards the transformative and strategic end of change. So probably over the last while, quite a bit of my mahi is in sector transformation. So background in the health domain through the founding stages of whānau ora, of trying to change the paradigm and the fabric there a bit. More recently, still working in some of that domain, working on things like cultural responsiveness in our primary care providers, trying to reframe practice. Working in the education sector, I guess I'm a dabbler. I've been a bit of a haututu in education, back to being a design lecturer in the in the mid 90s, through to and that was I guess when we were migrating diplomas and certs over to degrees. So I was involved in moving a design from a design diploma into turning it into a design degree, developing kaupapa Māori pathways through it, and trying to work with the organisation I was with. In terms of te tiriti responsiveness, and this is in the mid-90s. Unfortunately, I still seem to be having some of the same conversations. But I've also worked in areas like justice reform. I've just come off the back of last year working on a kaupapa called Paihere Tia Te Moka Tangata for the Hokairangi strategy under the Justice and Department of Corrections, working with tāne and in the system or recently out of the system and their whānau, and fundamentally trying to rethink and reframe and redesign our justice system. So that's the sort of the mahi I get involved in with the education sector. I've just come off, actually this morning I was presenting on tiriti responsiveness to all the incoming Workforce Development Council members for the reform of vocational education. I spent a year on one of the interim establishment boards there. One of the roles I currently have as a contractor is as Kaituhu Mātua Māori for Education NZ Manapoka Te Ao, and I'm involved in the reframing, rethinking international education, or from a Māori lens, actually rethinking the future of Māori learning within a global context. So I do most of our futurist kind of visioning kind of mahi, and then backcasting and getting on with the mahi to make the shift happen. So, and recently, because of COVID, we've all been in pivot mode. I know you've all had challenges in the school system, reframing the way you're teaching and learning and engaging. I've been doing that mahi across working with some tourism providers, having to pivot. Worked with Te Tauta Whiri, Etere Māori was one of my clients last year when we had to move from the first round, not this year's one, but last year, move away from march and site-based present activities to an online kaupapa of trying to enlist people in the moment and in a movement into our tuku reo. So reframing, rethinking, pivoting, re-strategizing. So that brings me to, I guess, my kōrero for today, which was I was asked again to sort of talk about how we design our education future in terms of designing and liberating the futures of our Rangatahi. So for me, the blueprint for that, if I can get my screen to work, yes, there we go, is the quite often referred to, I'll call it a strategic framework of that whakatauki, ko te pai tāwhiti, whaia kia tata, ko te pai tata whakamaua kia tina. And the way I had that explained to me was, and its origins in back in the Pacific, was if you were to ready your voyaging waka on the shore to depart to a destination unknown beyond the visible horizon, that the tohunga would stand with you until you could manifest in your mind that destination, that you did not leave that beach until that destination was manifest in your mind, and you were then able to set your sights on the near horizon, te pai tata, to trig fix your point and go, that's the trajectory, that's where we're aiming and how we'll get there. So, but of course, the phenomena on this one, when we're talking in a Pacific voyaging context, is as you journey to that horizon, it keeps changing. And as you journey, your journey is disrupted. The wind changes, the ocean currents shift. It's a dynamic movement of a perpetual horizon, a continuous voyage without end. And that to me is a really good way to start thinking about how we frame futures. It's the relentless pursuit of the envisioned destination with agility and adaptation in between. And so that whakatauki asks us to do that before we leave the beach, we set our points on that destination beyond the visible horizon, and then we backcast to set our point on the visible horizon that will get us there. And we hold dear to that and pursue it. But of course, we do that as we're voyaging. We're thinking that ka mua ka muri, what's in front of us, guided by what's behind us, whether we're looking backwards to go into the future or looking into the future, glancing backwards, whatever that analogy is, it gives us, it's both a time and distance concept. So, and I understand that word Tāwhiti in that context was also some staging grounds across the Pacific. So no accident that we've got an island called Tahiti, and that in Fiji we've got Viti Lavu, from that same kupu Tāwhiti. So, so I talk about this stuff because I think when we're talking with our rangatahi, that it's actually them getting a sense that actually our blueprints are there. Our blueprints for future aspiration, our future journeys, our manifesting our imaginary destinations, of striving for a future beyond the visible horizon, of creating a line of sight to it. All of that fabric is there in our kōrero. I note one of your speakers, I think later today, is talking about pūrākau as pedagogy. Yeah, there it is. So I'm going to start with a bit of my pūrākau, my backstory. Ka mua ka muri, I'm going to go back a wee bit. So for me, as a young lad, our whānau are mutton birders. So I remember Kuia saying to me once, oh, you don't need to do your whole pepeha, just tell people you're a mutton birder, they know where you're from. So this is our Titi Motu Potama. It's right off the southwest cape of Rakiura. So for me, growing up as a young lad through the schooling system, while I was being educated, I was attending this other whare wānanga called Potama. So for 2 months every year, we were on that island during the titi harvest. So bringing it back to that context of the titi, that's one of those beyond the visible horizon explorers. But on our island there, you see there our little kaik, our little community of whare there, where it's multi-generational whānau and our whanauka, our kin, who all share in those customary practices and rights to harvest on those titi motu. Our particular one being the farthest south of the lot. We must have been the greatest pacifists to end up down there, get pushed south further and further. But hey, look, on that bottom right there, you'll see an image of Te Moana Nui Akiwa. And those scribbly coloured lines are titi tracking. So one of my quite clever cousins who's done a zoology PhD on the titi, marrying zoological sciences and our mātauraka, did this tracking, and we can see there it goes right up around the Pacific, up off the coast of Japan, up to Kamchatka, up around that east into Bering Sea, around Alaska, off the coast of California, back down here into the southern oceans, with some venturing off to the coast of Chile. Actually, there's an island off the Straits of Magellan called Whafo, which is the only other place these some titi nest in that whole hikoi. The longest recorded annual migration of anything on the planet at around 60,000 kilometres. So ka manawa titi, that heart and resilience of the titi is an amazing thing. So, you know, for us, if I put it in a contemporary context, so that titi, that mahinga kai practice, that was our vocation that we were raised in. And it's an intergenerational whānau enterprise. If I take it from the science again, if we take the scientific evidence from carbon dating of a fire pit we ran across when we were digging for a long drop, estimate around 500 years of sun presence on that island. So predates any sense of migration or occupation. So that voyaging down to these islands for the resource has been going on for a long time. But look, I think the thing here is that not only was it our intergenerational whānau enterprise, but it was our whare wānanga, is where we had our other education. I'll quote here a colleague and friend of mine, many of you might know, Trevor Moiki, and I recall him once saying, you know, never let your education get in the way of your learning. So look, so we used to go to school for our education, what is that, a 9-month year, of which we attended 7 months. 2 months a year we were on this whare wānanga called Pautama. It was our whare wānanga o Takaroa, our whare wānanga o Te Wānui o Tānei, and all of those things. So where we learn the tradition was, because we go together as a whānau, 3 generations generally on an island together. So the tradition is that you are taught by your baua and your kuia, that the grandparents teach the mokopuna, because the pakeke are the productive birders. So they're mahi ata mahi, they're doing the hard work. So the older generation takes the responsibility for passing the knowledge and the practice and the customs to the youngest. So that image there is my late father passing that on to my boy. This is about a decade ago. You'll see their progression. So, you know, there's that model there of unbroken intergenerational transmission of customary knowledge, of te tai ao, te tai moana, te ngahere, te manu, and not just that, but the tikanga associated with it, and the practices that go with that. And to be blunt, when I was young, we didn't have the reo in our household or in our whānau, but we walked the talk. We did all the practices. Stuff I now know are called manaki and tiaki and whanaungatanga. We didn't use those terms; they weren't in our vocabulary. But actually, we did it, and so that was our school of learning. Things like our tiaki legacy as resource custodians on those islands. I get a bit disheartened when I see the suite of tangas on the wall of government departments like kaitiakitanga, manakitanga, because to me those things are very real. They're not aspirational and they're not ideals. The concept of being a kaitiaki in this scenario is actually, it's not a choice, it's a necessity, because when you realize your livelihood and your well-being is directly interdependent with the environment you occupy and the resources upon which you are reliant for your well-being, you have that duty of care, and you have a sense of consequence, because you see the direct actions, you see the consequences of your actions. So these aren't fluffy ideas or ideals, they're realities, and they're quite pragmatic practices. So to me, that learning, while I was getting an education in school, the learning that informed who I am was more in this domain. And knowing that actually that 500 plus year tradition of trade, it's in our DNA. Our enterprise was there, our work ethic was there, the intimacy of knowledge was there. It was being transmitted intergenerationally and still is. It's in our whakapapa, it's in our DNA, it's in our being. So, you know, we quite often get this label, thanks to that movie, Once We're Warriors. And yes, there's truth to that. But we forget to tell the other stories about being these Pacific adventurers and traders, and the dynamism of our tupuna. And yes, we were global citizens. I'm part of these conversations at the moment about what does global citizenship mean in New Zealand. Well, here it is here, a couple of illustrations from a friend of mine, illustrations for a book my father was writing about some of our Southern legacy. The image on the left is of Tuha Waiki. Tuha Waiki was the ariki down there who was one of our 3 signatories in the Deep South to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. at that point in time, he was already trading internationally. He had his ships, he was trading flax, trading furs, and got into trading other stuff. You see him there dressed in British regalia in an admiral's costume with an armed bodyguard dressed in red coats. He'd been to Sydney and he'd traded there. He'd met the general, they'd become friends. And on his departure to Hawaii, impressed upon him how impressed he'd been with his personal bodyguard and with their discipline and all these things. The general got his officers to gift them these uniforms. So when he turned up on the HMS Herald under Major Bunbury to sign the tiriti, it was dressed like this. And he set up a constabulary on Ruapuki Island. He invited the missionary there to establish the church. He became our ambassador, our trade commissioner, our centre for negotiations, and he flew that flag of the Declaration of Independence up until the 1880s, long after the signing of treaty was being flown on that island, Ruapuki, in the middle of Te Arakiwa Whauwau Strait. The image on the right is the contra story. Despite what it may look like, the image there is of a chief, one of our southern chiefs, Honekai, who was taking utu retaliation to some sealers and waders who'd been stealing from them. So they met their retribution. But the backdrop there is Toki Toki, Honekai's niece, who saw the plight of one young Pākehā man by the name James Cadell, and she covered him in her whāraki, putting him under the mantle of her protection so he remained unharmed. She eventually took him, and he was raised in the kaik with that whānau and married into it. He eventually took on the status of an ariki in that whānau and took on full facial moko. He was referred to by Europeans as the White Chief, Jimmy the Boy, all sorts of other names. He was one of those Māori Pākehā that historians seem to write about a wee bit. But he must have been quite an enigma, because there he was. He fought with our people. He traded on our behalf. He brokered deals in Sydney. Apparently he was quite the sight in Sydney because of this Pākehā guy, full facial moko, negotiating there for Māori. So we were global citizens. And I love this quote from Uncle Tipene. I had the opportunity once to interview him, and I was asking him about defining and describing our culture. And this is some of what he said. You know, we come from a culture of dynamic adaptation and rapid adoption. I keep coming back to this quote because it says something about our tradition, not the artifacts of our tradition, but the tradition of our culture. And if you know Tipene, he doesn't say anything he can't back up with empirical research. So the dynamic adaptation in terms of how quickly we encountered new places and adapted to them, adapted tools, changed the materials, whether it was putting the kohatu in the kumara pits to keep the warmth, to keep the warmth in the soil for the kumara to go, all this myriad of endless things that demonstrate this dynamic adaptation and rapid adoption when new technologies arrived here, new tools. We'd pick up a musket, but adopt it for our use and adapt it, carve it, give it a name like we would a tefa tefa. So that culture was strong. So it brings us kind of to this Māori story that we don't tell ourselves enough. And this is a story I penned after years of doing work with a whole bunch of Māori businesses and enterprises, trying to understand what makes us tick and what our story is. If there's a New Zealand story, what's the Māori story? So reminding us that we are people of land and sea. That legacy of our ancestors being lived every day when we're exercising that bold adventurous spirit, that love and care for people, and that deep connection with place, and that it's in perpetuity. Aki tono atu. So again, in terms of that legacy and the aspiration that it drives, the lift that it gives, the ambition that it suggests we should have. Here's further words from Tā Tipene. He's talking here about the new generation of leaders we need to entrust with our assets that we've had to fight to get back and recover, and that nothing but the best, the world's best, is good enough for them. That actually in doing that, we have to really embrace excellence. Now, I listened a bit to my tuahina Kathy Irwin this morning talking about that e tipu e rea, same sort of sentiment out of Tā Apirana. And Kathy and I used to sit on the council together of Te Mana Whakahaere o Te Wānanga Aotearoa. So I heard a great deal of admiration for Kathy. But, this is lofty aspirations. Only excellence will achieve the rangatiratanga of which we dream. So how do we embed that belief and thinking and aspiration in our rangatahi? And it's there in these kinds of whakataiki. Whai ata I te kahuraki, me te tuokwe he mihi mauha teikei. That aspiration's about seeking the lofty heights. Should you be bowed down, should you placate yourself, let it be to that lofty challenge, that lofty mountain. But I want to add something here. And this image says it, and I've labeled it. You need a base camp. Now, if you are going to pursue those lofty heights, get into uncharted territory, take big endeavors and big risks, you want to do it with the comfort and safety of a base camp. What is it that grounds you, that stabilizes you, that you can return to, that provides confidence, safety, security, and stability? So our rangatahi need the same thing. If we want them to innovate, if we want them to aspire to the loftiest heights, we have to give them their base camp. And for a lot of us, that's our tūranga waiwai. So here's my kids, this is about a decade ago. And I say, actually, that tūranga waiwai, that titi motu pautama, is at least one place we can stand and say, this is ours. We have that authority to speak. We are the knowledge carriers. We make the decisions. We can stand here with confidence, and actually others aren't allowed, legally not allowed to. That really is our tūranga waiwai. So the task that I took on with our kids was to ensure they have that base camp. The season they did this, we did the hikoi whenua, tuku iho. We went around our land blocks. We went to Aoraki. We travelled to our titi mutu. They learned from their grandfather, and we give them that grounding. But that aspirational part, what is it we need to do? So, and I've framed it here around aptitude, attitude, and altitude. Aptitude, we actually really need to actually be able to identify the talents and foster the talents in our kids. Not make them fit the mold, but make the mold fit them. How do we liberate that? With the traditional wānanga, the first wānanga you might attend was to determine which wānanga you would attend because of your aptitude, your natural talents, your propensity for, your inherited knowledge of. But attitude is everything. Work ethic, self-belief, the commitment to, the desire. And altitude, how lofty is it? Are we really elevating these aspirations? If you have a whānau that's saying, oh yeah, you might get a job one day, versus, oh yeah, you're going to run the country one day. What is it? What are we doing to lift their altitude? And for me, it's simple. A practical demonstration. When I was being raised with my parents, neither of whom got school C, but they were bloody hard workers. But when we were on that titi motu, when we were tolerating our correspondence school pack and learning on our whare wānanga down there, they always talked about when you get your degree, when you get your degree, when you get your degree. Part of our household everyday conversation, they never had it, but they normalized that conversation for us. Another generation on, the conversation I've normalized with my kids, when you start your business, when you invent, right? Normalizing that as the expectation and the conversation in the whare. And this is hopefully what it does. So there's those three kids from a decade ago, more recently within the last year. So the one on the left there with the fisheries and the poly bin, he's my middle boy. So he, the last 2 years back to back, he was the Rangatahi Entrepreneur of the Year through the YES program. But what he drew on was our mā tauraka tuku iho. So he decided to tackle a burning issue for our iwi in our export of fisheries around sustainability. And from his lens, exporting in poly bins was unpalatable. So he undertook to design an alternative to the poly bins. Where he ended up was drawing on our mātauraka tuku iho. What was our poly bin of old? It was the titi poha, the kelp bag made from the rimurapa. That was our poly bag, was our Ziploc bag, was our storage bin, was all of those things that we protected, transported, and preserved our titi in. So he looked into it. And the wall structure of the rimurapa has the same insulative properties. So he 3D printed those wall structures into these bins out of biopolymers. So reusable, compostable, putting it into a circular economy. It hasn't quite scaled it up to commercial capability, but he's gone on from that now. He's been doing a first year at Vic Uni in Design for Social Innovation. And he was invited into this global kaitiakitanga project. In fact, he should have been at Dubai now, but he elected not to because of COVID and everything else. Being there as part of a global youth forum on innovation and youth futures. My daughter there in the middle, the enterprise strength, she looked in the backyard. We're in Hawke's Bay, the apple industry. The enterprise she developed was looking at an alternative to the plastic fruit stickers. She's still running that business now. They've just partnered with Callaghan for another wave of research where they're using a byproduct from apple waste to develop a fully hot water soluble, fully home compostable alternative to the plastic fruit stickers. Watch this space. The youngest one, talking about Te Pai Tawhiti, his head's out in the stars and out in Aotearangi. And he's got a passion for rockets, aeronautical industry, space. And as you can see there, he's self-taught in the design software to do that stuff. He's been designing rocket engine systems, conceiving new forms of propulsion. And his trajectory is into design or architecture, something that we'll get into thinking about habitats and potentially outer worldly habitats. So this is the lift. And it's there, again, it's in our blueprints. So one thing that's always fascinated me is when it's not uncommon to stand up, tau parapara, to stand up when we go to do our pai kōrero. And we use that saying, ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kākā, ka tangi hoki koe te hei mauri ora. And the way I had explained to me by my po was, he said, oh, well, when we're saying ka tangi te titi, we're talking about that global explorer. We're listening in to that manu that has traversed the Pacific and brought back all of that intel and insight about the health of the environment out there, about what's going on outside beyond the visible horizon. And then when we say ka tangi te kākā, we're talking about the chatterbox of the forest, the gossip manga. So we're saying that we have tuned in and listened out there. We have listened to the call of the titi and its messaging from te ao, te Wananui Akiwa, with the Pai Tawhiti. And we have tuned in at home. So we are fit to speak. So it does that global, local sense, like the Pai Tawhiti, Pai Tata, ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kākā. So we kind of have these cultural blueprints that are we teaching them to our kids? I teach these to my kids. It gives them a cultural sensibility and way of thinking and looking at the world. So when we talk about that Pai Tawhiti, ka tangi te titi, we're talking about creating a line of sight to the future beyond the visible horizon. And I say creating a line of sight to the future because that's where aspiration is driven. That's the kind of trajectory and projection. And I love this quote from Marion Wright Edelman. You can't be what you can't see. So if they've got no exposure, no vision, no end opportunity in sight, no self-belief, it's very, very hard to get there. It's very hard to wake up with a sense of purpose, to swing your feet out of bed in the morning and get on with a sense of drive. But similarly, that te pai tata, the ka tangi te kākā, we've actually got to act today. We've got to create the connections. We've got to take action. So like my youngest one in the aeronautical stuff, right back when he was young in primary school, he dreamed and schemed some Boeings, I can't remember what he called it, the Boeing 7, something like that, with about 40 engines strapped on it. And I said, hey, let's send that to the design division at Boeing. And we did send off this email with his picture, and and not expecting any response. And a couple of weeks later, we got a response from the head of design division at Boeing in Seattle, commenting back to my boy about how great his work was. Unfortunately, we probably can't produce that just yet, but we need great minds like yours in the future. Now, that does a hell of a lot to buoy a kid. You know, so in terms of sitting there as a kaiako, and I know it's very hard with a room full of kids, how do we create that line of sight to future and opportunity? Because it's out there, not in here. And how do we take action today that joins the dots for them? Simple connections. You know, often that's no harder than going on Google and finding somebody or something or a business or an enterprise or something with whom they can engage, start a conversation. That head of the Boeing design division, he ended up in about a 2-week dialogue with my boy about flight, aviation, aeronautics, and you know, saying things about the Wright brothers. And of course, we went back and went, well, hang on. Don't forget our Kiwi flying inventors. How do we get this in the education system? There's lots of challenges, you know, and there are all sorts of barriers to actually reframing things from a Māori worldview. So I know we've got more liberty to do that within Koanga Reo Kura Kapapa Wānanga, but we're still within a system that doesn't necessarily, not that it needs to validate it, but recognise it as equal. But, you know, the challenge for the system is to walk the talk. We do have this unprecedented liberating piece of legislation passed last year that actually in its fundamental core of its purpose says that it's incumbent upon them to establish and regulate a system that honours Te Tiriti o Waitangi and supports Māori Crown relationships. They don't have the answers. They don't know what that means, to be honest. I've been interacting with them through the review of vocational education and in my recent masi, and they're scratching their heads at this. It's our space to seize. It's our space to recast and redefine what that means. And why? Because we need to. Because by the time we hit 2038 and 36% of kids are Māori, this picture of what's happening in our current system is not good enough. You know, that we're getting over 50% without tertiary quals. The rate of fallout is not good enough. So that we're back to the system and back to ourselves is to liberate the space for Māori to be Māori, just for it to be normal. So whether it's our ahua, our waha, tikanga reo mātauranga, to normalise that in the space. So we do have these levers in Te Tiriti. You know, in terms of actually recognising the government, the Crown's responsibility around that, what system it develops, and is it developing a system that will deliver what we need, will deliver what our Rangatahi need in terms of liberating that space of rangatiratanga around mātauranga Māori, around ensuring equal access, participation, success, progression, achievement. Knowing that all of the instruments they create can either liberate or disable that pursuit. So, you know, so I think when we start to push for recognition that things like legislation, like regulation, like policy, like structures are all cultural constructs, we've got to call it out, hold up the mirror and go, if that we're not reflected in many of those constructs, where are we? And they need to be held to account on it. And I'd say the mahi I'm involved in, we're sort of doing that on a daily basis because they continue to issue without that thoughtfulness or mindfulness or that view front of mind. So we continue to receive policy devoid of tiriti, devoid of recognition of rangatiratanga, devoid of recognising he tirahanga Māori. So, you know, and so we've got a job as a sector to hold that to account and to get recognition of our mātauranga as a taonga, that it is to be Māori-led and controlled, and that it's not generic, that it's geolocated. You know, that when we're doing show and tell about mātariki and we are drawing on the richness of the mahi and whakaro from Dr. Rangi Mātāmua, that we recognise that that's tūhoi knowledge. and that we should be pursuing our own as well, or presenting it in other contexts. So there's a challenge there. And how do we start to reframe the way we look at what we are focused on within the education system under a framework of Mātauranga Māori, under our ontology? So how our creation narrative and atua domains create the infrastructure and systems for our knowledge systems. So how are we doing that? How do we bring that into the mix and put it on the table? So the way we start to package and present knowledge reflects our ontology, our epistemology, and then is delivered in accordance with our pedagogy. So the challenge is this, and as part of a conference last week around this, exploring the future of learning in a global context, and we were talking about the resistance to change, about the inertia of the present system, which I love the late Sir Ken Robinson, who put it in context by talking about it, being brought in and framed in the age and culture of enlightenment, cast in the Industrial Revolution along factory lines, where the most important thing about a student was their date of manufacture. Now that system's broken. It doesn't work. It's not fit for purpose. And our Rangatahi are pushing back on it. Even my own, my daughter there that you saw there, she's finishing her last year at Vic. She's tolerated the tertiary education system. My son, who did that polybin, he's finishing his first year. I'd say he's tolerating the system. He's actually looking to pivot out and do something else, and maybe study part-time and online. That system's not serving them well. So we have to be prepared to recast and rethink. And that immune system, I've been encountering it head on through the reform of vocational education, because it looks a bit like this. When we're advocating and trying to drive transformative change, there is a huge amount of resistance and inertia and defense of status quo. So we get all the reasons why we can't, why we shouldn't, why we don't. We can talk the Department of Status Quo. It's also the Department of No most of the time. And I sort of got to that point of realization last year. I said, well, when we're pushing forward our visions and our aspirations and expectations, the response is quite often deaf. And I talked about deaf as in defend, defer, deflect, either defense of status quo, deferral, oh yeah, that's a great point, maybe we could do that in the next review in 3 years' time, or deflect, no, that's not my responsibility, that's another department. And so, and they hide behind the shield of regulations, timelines, policies, budgets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a myriad of reasons that this immune system puts up to resist change and to resist, I call this TDT virus, that the actual reality is the rhetoric isn't being aligned with the behaviour. That what's being represented in the legislation and espoused in the high-level rhetoric is not matched in action. The action is quite contrary in many cases. And I think this is also one of the challenges. I love this table here from Kate Sutton, who's a Kiwi in Bangkok, heads up the Innovation Centre for the United Nations Development Programme. And she talks about this problem-solving thing differentiating between technical problems and adaptive challenges. Technical problems are easy. You kind of know what the problem is. You probably know what the solution is. And so the authorities and experts can get on with it. The only barriers are things like time and cost. Adaptive challenges, transformative stuff, shifting the paradigm, the pedagogy of education, problems unclear. We really can't articulate it hugely well in a way that's clearly understood. And the solutions, we can't predefine them all because we haven't gone there yet. We've got pieces of the puzzle. We've got partial solutions. We've got exemplars. We don't have massive solutions. So the responsibility for design of that becomes collaborative. It demands we work with the end users, the beneficiaries, the stakeholders. It's a wider group. And that actually what the obstacles are then become things like prejudices, biased, what's front of mind or not for somebody, whether there's even mindfulness. So it brings us back, and I bring it back to this. about the power of manifesting the destination in mind before we leave the beach. That it's incumbent upon us to try and build that clarity of what it is we want and what our Rangatahi want, and for them to build their own clarity to make it explicit enough and tangible enough that we can kind of begin that journey. And I know for a lot of our Rangatahi, they don't have that tūranga waiwai. You know, and you've got to think, what are the things that will build that? So if they don't know their whakapapa, if they don't know their whenua, if they're not connected to their whānau beyond a couple of people, or even don't even know who their grandparents, great-grandparents were, how do we provide the proxy of that tūranga waiwai, that sense of place, sense of belonging, sense of identity? It's a challenge, I know. You know, but it's through the kōrero and through the exploration and through the questioning and the exploration that we start to get that sense. So, like I say, it's if we can build that base camp, we're free to explore. But again, coming back to acknowledging our own models, our own ontology that sits behind our pedagogy. We have our innovation frameworks. You know, I've used this. This is part of a creation narrative, one of our kaitahu creation narratives. So we know this stuff, right? Te kore kore, he pō he ao kā o tia, or te kore ki te pō ki te whai ao ki te ao marama. We have our own versions of it. It is creative process. It is innovation process. It is the cycle of every day. It is birth cycle. It is cycle of thinking from absence of mind to subconscious thought, to conscious thought, to tangible expression. It is from conception to pregnancy, to the act of birth, to birth into te ao marama. We have our innovation fabric. We have our creative process. We have our creation stories. We just need to connect with them and apply them in a modern context. I'm a firm believer that all the solutions, the tools we need are all there in the culture. And, you know, and I guess I'll close on this thought, because how deeply embedded in the DNA that is right down to our very own cultural sensibilities and place-based sensibilities. You know, I was reflecting on a karakia that was shared with us. When I say us, I'm a part of a group called Ngā Aho Incorporated, a Māori Design Society that I was one of the founders of. It's about 12 years old. But Mātua Hardy Williams is a co-mātua for us. And he shared this karakia, and I call it our Māori Feng Shui. Kei runga ko rangi nui, kei raro ko papatuanuku, kei mua ko te moana, kei muri ko te nāhiri, kei tēnei taha ko ngā awa ko te ponawai, kei te rātaha ko ngā wāhi mahinga kai, kei konei ko te kāinga ko ngā oranga katoa, koko ia e ara ia. And to me, that's a beautiful karakia that is about grounding and placing and positioning ourselves in the fabric of between Ranginui and Papatuanuku within Te Tai Ao in front of Te Tai Moana. If you locate yourself in that, this is the roadmap, the GPS map, to work out where is the good place to live in our cultural landscape, in our natural world. All the elements of life and necessity there. But it places us with the Ngāhiri, with the bush behind us, the source of our sustenance, but it faces us to the moana, to the perpetual voyaging horizon and the imagination into the distance. So again, te pai tawhiti, te pai tata, ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kākā, kei mua ki te moana, kei muri ko te Ngāhiri. The blueprint's there. So nō reira, a ka mutu tōku kōrero, I'm really open to now open up the floor for some Q&A, and I see a few questions running there. Hopefully somebody's paid more attention to that than I have, so that I can just open up a bit of kōrero. I will